So welcome to History 116, and we should probably start by noting that in a way we're beginning our story midway. History 116, kind of a continuation of History 115, but I will work on the assumption that many of you have not taken History 115 and therefore try to fill you in on any necessary background regarding things you would have learned in History 115 and perhaps are necessary for understanding what we're talking about now. So we're kind of starting our story here in Europe during the High Middle Ages. And so a couple of things just to point out right away looking at the map. During this period, we're starting to see the emergence of more centralized kingdoms where kings have more direct authority over their territory, right? So they're beginning to consolidate control. And there are a number of factors underlying this that we're going to be discussing. So you see, and some of the map is starting to look somewhat familiar with respect to the present day map, the Kingdom of France roughly corresponding to modern day France. Spain as yet to consolidate itself into a single kingdom, but that process is beginning to get underway here. We see England, Scotland. There is no United Kingdom at this point, and the further east we go, the borders between kingdoms are a bit more vague, and that is kind of reflected in the way the map is drawn up here. One thing I do want to point out, because it could be misleading, that very large orange territory in the center, that is the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire is in some ways more an idea than a reality at this juncture. You have a Holy Roman Emperor. In theory, they have authority over all the territory that you see indicated there. In actual reality, the Holy Roman Emperor has very limited direct authority. You have a large number of small kingdoms contained within, and that is, it's more at that level of kind of kingdoms, principalities, in some cases even independent free cities, bishoprics, where you have a bishop who has political authority, where the real power lies. So, as far as what pretty much corresponds to modern day Germany and to a large extent Italy, there is no unified German or Italian state at this point. Occasionally, Holy Roman emperors will try to assert real authority, but it is never really going to stick. And so not until the 19th century will you see any kind of real political unification in those territories, right? But I did want to point that out because, looking at the map, it would appear that you have this massive unified empire in the center, and that's in fact not the case. So this is Europe during what we call the High Middle Ages, and in a sense, kind of the last stage of the Middle Ages, a period that Europe is about to come out of. And in fact, this lecture is really more about developments leading into and corresponding to the Renaissance. One last thing, the term Middle Ages is actually a term invented by learned individuals during the Renaissance looking back at the period prior to them, right? So if you went back in time to the quote-unquote Middle Ages, you wouldn't encounter any individual who would say, oh, welcome to the Middle Ages, right? It's kind of the idea that it is this period sandwiched between the classical period of the ancient Greeks and Romans and the Renaissance, a Middle Ages, sometimes called the Dark Ages because there's also this idea that not much was happening intellectually or culturally during this period. Something a lot of historians would dispute, by the way, but that was definitely a perception from the period of the Renaissance. So a few things about European society at this point. Very often we break it down into three social groups, what we often call the three estates. And this pretty much corresponds to all of Europe at this time. So you have the first estate, which basically consisted of the clergy, those affiliated with the church. And during the High Middle Ages in most of Europe, certainly Western Europe, you have really just the Catholic Church. The church as an institution, very wealthy, but individual members of the clergy, tremendous range, variation in terms of wealth. I mean, you have some that at the higher level that are very wealthy. Most were probably quite poor, particularly if you're talking about, kind of village priests or parish priests and so forth. The second estate was made up of the nobility, or lords, nobles, right? So these are individuals who basically most of the time are quite wealthy, with most of that wealth is really about large landed estates. It's kind of tied into property. But it also reflects a kind of social status of privilege, right? So they would have been entitled to many privileges that the common folk were not. So the idea is, by virtue of being a noble, you have a title, and this is the really important point, right? What makes you a noble is not simply the fact that you're wealthy. It is something that you must be born into. You are a noble because you were born into a noble family. Occasionally, the king does have the authority to ennoble a family or an individual, but for the most part, if you're a noble, you were born into it. And even though for the most part nobles are wealthy, if for whatever reason a noble lost all their wealth, they would still be a noble, right? It really is about the title, something you inherit. And by the way, the nobility, the clergy, all together making up less than 10% of the population. The vast bulk of that would have constituted the third estate. And probably the simplest definition for the third estate, it would be individuals not belonging to the first or the second estates. They are the common people, mostly peasants, but it does also include merchants, townspeople. So again, though, simplest definition, anyone not in the first or second estates. And most are quite poor, but it's not about wealth. You do have some peasants and certainly merchants, townspeople who are quite wealthy. But having wealth doesn't make them nobles. So as already mentioned, right, when we're talking about the church, particularly in Western Europe, we're talking about the Catholic Church. So the Protestant Reformation hasn't happened yet. We're still in the Middle Ages. Of course, in Eastern Europe, you have the Orthodox Church, and they don't recognize the authority of the Pope. But we're really right now focusing on developments in Western Europe. We'll look at what's going on in other parts of Europe later. So the term Catholic actually means universal, right? So kind of the idea that you have this universal church under the authority of the Pope in Rome. And of course, I think most of you are aware that within the Catholic Church, you have a very strict hierarchy wherein the Pope sits at the top and has absolute authority. Now, the church, if we're talking about the High Middle Ages in particular, tremendously influential in the day-to-day affairs of most Europeans, right? Even at the village level, right? In the village, the most important institution, most important building would have been the church. And, this is very different from today where, people go to church on Sunday and then the rest of the week they don't really think that much about it. In fact, church is very often closed during the rest of the week. That wouldn't have been the case back in the day, right? So, church definitely important from a religious point of view, but this is also probably where you got most of your news from. This is where you would hang out, where you might conduct business, where you met other villagers to exchange gossip. If you walked into the church, you might find, just people kind of hanging out, children playing in the corner, even people gambling in a different part of the church. So very central to the lives of people. If we consider that the most important events in an individual's life would have been tied to the church, baptism, marriage, confirmation, and so forth, what we call the sacraments. If we consider the various feast days celebrating different saints, church is at the heart of it. And that meant that the church was very, very powerful throughout Europe in a political sense. And that also, of course, would correspond to individuals at the higher level, not just the Pope, archbishops, bishops, and so forth. And very often kings found themselves at odds with the church, this kind of feeling that the church was challenging their authority within their own kingdoms. And so there, from a pretty early point, this is an ongoing struggle that we encounter if we begin our story in the High Middle Ages, where the kings and church are vying for control and for ultimate authority within the various kingdoms. And a lot of this centered over who had control, who got to appoint church officials, who had access to the wealth of churches and monasteries, and so forth. right? Did they answer ultimately to the king with respect to whatever territory they were based in, or did they answer to the Pope? And this struggle probably manifested itself most profoundly in what is known as the Investiture Struggle. And, so kind of the ultimate measure of who had authority in a kingdom, the king or the Pope, the Pope residing in Rome, so very often not actually in the kingdom, centered around who got to appoint church officials, the Pope or the king. In theory, the appointments were made by both. So this is what the term investiture refers to. It's kind of the idea that the Pope would nominate, quote unquote, nominate an individual, and the king would confirm that individual, thus investing them with authority with respect to churches within his kingdom. But this became kind of the focal point of the struggle between king and pope. One very famous incident then was what would be called the Investiture Controversy, centered around Pope Gregory VII and the Emperor Henry IV, King Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire. And it really had to do specifically with who would be able to make an appointment. What if they had different individuals that they wanted to see appointed? And ultimately, Pope Gregory VII would forbid church officials from receiving investiture from lay rulers, right? So you might be saying, well, ultimately, why does it matter? Well, again, you have to appreciate how influential the church was in the day-to-day lives of Europeans, right? Or shall I put it a different way, with respect to the subjects of a king. So the investiture controversy centered around a specific vacancy for the bishopric of Milan, and Henry IV and Gregory VII ultimately backed different candidates. And in some ways, it really wasn't about, the different individuals that they were supporting. It really ultimately came down to, an attempt to define or assert one's right to make that call. And, King Henry IV, in a sense, was challenging the authority of the Pope within the Holy Roman Empire. The Pope threatened him with excommunication. And that, I don't know how familiar most of you are with the concept of excommunication. It's basically the idea of throwing you out of the Catholic Church. But that would also suggest that when you die, that you're not going to make it to heaven. And back during the High Middle Ages, that would have been a pretty serious thing. Also, I think many of a king's subjects would be very reluctant to follow that king if they knew that said individual had been excommunicated. So that was a pretty powerful thing, right? The emperor, for his part, demanded that the German bishops reject the Pope's authority. So really putting the bishops within the Germanic territories of the Holy Roman Empire between a rock and a hard place, if you will. Ultimately, the Pope responded by excommunicating the king, which in a sense freed his subjects from having to be loyal to him. More importantly, it was perceived by many of the German nobles, particularly the various German kings, and we already talked about how they had in some ways more direct authority than the emperor, to rebel against the emperor. So in the end, Henry IV is going to cave and will actually travel to Italy, and where he'll meet the Pope at the town of Canossa and beg for his forgiveness. And ultimately the Pope agrees to forgive him, partly though because he had no choice. Would appear the Pope won, but in some ways a very clever maneuver by Henry IV, because again, the Pope really had no option but to forgive him by virtue of representing the Catholic faith. And, if somebody's pleading for forgiveness, he really has no choice. In any event, the struggle represented by the investiture controversy would continue with their respective successors. Eventually, a compromise will be reached with the Concordat of Worms. Worms is a city in present-day Germany. It has nothing to do with the squiggly creatures that any of you who fish perhaps you use on your fish hook. So the basis of the compromise, church officials would elect bishops who would then be invested by their secular lords. So in some ways, really just kind of confirming the practice that had already been followed. But I mean, it was kind of now more, shall we say, set in stone. So, we really do have to note, though, that this whole investiture controversy really saw the Pope asserting a tremendous degree of authority, right? Not simply that the church should manage its own affairs, make its own appointments. The church had actually claimed the right to depose kings. So this is a pretty kind of serious matter from the perspective of kings. So we might ask, we're going to come back to this at some point, who will eventually win out in this struggle between secular rulers and the Pope? And I always ask this question. If we were in the classroom, a lot of students always say, oh, well, the Pope. Let me just say this. I'd ask you, who has real authority today? Secular governments or the Pope? And I think if we consider how things are going to turn out when we get right up to the present, it's pretty clear that secular rulers are going to win out. But it's not going to happen overnight. One other very important development during the High Middle Ages that we should consider here, and certainly evidence of the great power and influence of the Catholic Church, is the Crusades. So these were a series of military campaigns waged in the name of Christendom and sanctioned by the Pope. And I should first of all note that the term Crusades is a kind of historian's term used looking back. It's not a term actually used at the time. And when I say a series of military campaigns, we very often talk about the First Crusade, the Second Crusade, and so forth. And these will carry on for a few hundred years. So we're going to focus here primarily on the First Crusade, which was aimed pretty much at, from the European perspective, recapturing Jerusalem and the Holy Land, roughly corresponding to modern-day Israel-Palestine, and so-called because it corresponds to most of the events that one finds in the Bible, particularly with respect to the life of Jesus, Jerusalem being especially important in that regard. So from a European perspective, the idea was that they were liberating Jerusalem from the Muslims, the infidel, and of course today we tend to think of most parts of the Middle East as, being part of the so-called quote-unquote Islamic world. And at the time of the Crusades, it really had only been a few hundred years since those territories had been part of the Byzantine Empire, and thus under Christian rule. So, trying to look at it from the point of view of Europeans during the High Middle Ages, that does make a bit of sense. And it was also, the Crusades were also about supporting the Byzantine Empire against Muslim expansion. Right? And by the way, we see there on the right a Crusader map of Jerusalem, one of the oldest maps that we have of that city. Regarding this idea of defending the Byzantine Empire, as you can see from this map, and particularly in connection with one major battle where the Byzantine Empire suffered a very devastating defeat, the Battle of Hastings occurred in 1071. So by 1081, shortly before the Crusades, the Byzantine Empire really did look like it was on its back foot, had lost a tremendous amount of territory in what roughly corresponds to modern-day Turkey. So the frontier, as you can see on this map, really very close to the capital of Constantinople. And at some point, the Byzantine Empire had actually called for help from Western Europe. Or more specifically, they directed their plea to the Pope at the time, Urban II. And he gathered together the important leaders of Europe, Western Europe, kings, lords, and so forth, at the Council of Clermont in 1095, calling upon Christians to take up their weapons against the infidel and join a holy war to recover the Holy Land. And by the way, I should note here that from from a European perspective, it had only been a few hundred years that Jerusalem and the surrounding environs had come under Muslim rule. Until then, they had been part of the Byzantine Empire. So from their point of view, it does make a bit of sense, this idea of recovering the Holy Land. In any event, right, as an added incentive, the Pope promised remission of sins. All who died in battle against pagans, i.e. the infidel, would have their sins forgiven automatically. In a sense, a one-way ticket to heaven. And so when the Crusaders set out, they did initially go to Constantinople, kind of with the idea of helping the Byzantine Empire fight back, to push back against the Muslim armies, reclaim territory, and so forth. But as soon as they got there, it very quickly became apparent that there'd be very little cooperation between the Byzantine Empire and these Crusaders. And they very quickly then turned their attention to the Holy Land. And in 1099, they quote-unquote liberated Jerusalem. And I should note it was a rather bloody liberation. Even according to the Crusaders' accounts, the blood ran up to the knees of their horses. They pretty much killed everyone in the city, regardless of what religion they belonged to, meaning also Christians and Jews, and then went on to establish 4 Crusader states, the most important of which would be the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, the other 3 being the County of Edessa, Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. So a couple of things here. There are 2 factors underlying why they were so successful. A lot of it had to do with the politically fragmented situation within the Muslim world at that time. Jerusalem not really perceived as a very important city, either politically or economically. Even though it is actually the 3rd holy city in Islam, as was the case back then. The other factor is they really just never anticipated armies coming from Europe. From their point of view, apart from the Byzantine Empire, Europe was essentially a backwater. So the idea that Europeans might pose, these barbarians to the north might pose a military threat, never anticipated. In any event, after the capture of Jerusalem, it would become something of a kind of catalyst for the unification of the Muslim world, where they would seek to drive the Crusaders out and, from their point of view, liberate the 3rd holiest city in Islam. And in the meantime, I should note, right, the Crusader states would kind of carry on for a few centuries, roughly until the 12th century, when finally one individual was able to unify the Muslim world in opposition to the Crusader states. And that individual would be Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, defender of the faith in Arabic, though, by the way, he was actually Kurdish, a distinct ethnicity, speaking their own language. And so he's better known in Europe, certainly within the English language, simply as Saladin. And he would first unite Syria and Egypt, creating one kingdom, effectively surrounding the Crusader states before finally mostly driving them out. The decisive battle, 1187, at which point Jerusalem was liberated. The Crusaders would kind of carry on, manage to keep a foothold in the region for a little bit longer, but pretty much by the 13th century they had been driven out. With subsequent crusades, attempting to recapture the Holy Land but failing. I do want to mention one last thing. Saladin had quite a good reputation as being a very chivalrous individual. This includes European accounts that would very often portray him as being very just, very fair. And so, for instance, after capturing Jerusalem, he allowed the Crusader Christians who had been residing there to leave with their property, and then tried to arrange things so that Christian pilgrims could make the pilgrimage to the holy sites in Jerusalem and be protected while doing so. One last thing to note, that during this period, Venice would become a really important maritime power within all of the Eastern Mediterranean. And quite happy, they were pretty indifferent to who actually controlled the so-called Holy Land. They were quite happy to trade with anyone. And that brings us to the kind of much broader development that is eventually going to pull Europe out of the Middle Ages. and that will be a revival in trade, right? So this actually begins during the High Middle Ages, but eventually it's going to basically take Europe out of the Middle Ages and eventually leading to the period that we often refer to as the Renaissance. So it starts primarily in connection with commercial activity involving artisans and craftspeople. So part of this reflects the fact that you have an increase in food production, freeing people to engage in other activities. Related to that, you're going to see increasing numbers of peasants running away from landed estates where they had been serfs. Under the system of feudalism, peasants were very often bound to the lands where they resided, to the landed estates where they were required to actually work on behalf of lords. So many of these people are now beginning to move to these kind of growing towns and even cities where they begin to engage in other kinds of activities. This is also going to serve to, over time, undermine the whole system of feudalism. At the forefront of this revival in trade are going to be cities in Italy. And in part, that reflects that during the Middle Ages, they kind of persevered, whereas throughout much of the center and northern part of Europe, cities and towns had become much smaller, many of them just completely disappearing. A lot of it had to do with the nature of feudalism, where these various landed estates tended to be very self-sufficient, so not a lot of economic activity by way of trade taking place. Cities in Italy had managed to hold on. Many of them had become smaller and poorer, but they're now able to take advantage of this revival in trade, which is initially going to center on the Mediterranean world, much of it in connection with the Byzantine Empire in Islamic world. Venice will be at the forefront, becoming a very, very powerful city-state. So it's quite small. It's a city and some surrounding hinterland, but even becoming powerful enough that they develop a navy. And before too long, other Italian cities are following suit, such as Genoa and Pisa. And we start to see Italian merchants establishing trading posts, not just throughout the Mediterranean, but also many parts of the Middle East and around the Black Sea. And so I have this map here of medieval Italy, just so we can kind of place some of these cities that we're talking about. In the northeast corner, you can see the city-state of Venice. So rather small, but again becoming very wealthy and influential in the region. Also a reminder, there is no unified Italian state at this point. The Italian peninsula made up of many, many different states, some of them very small city-states, such as Genoa and Pisa, which you can kind of see if you look closely on the western coast of Italy, but also becoming very active in the Mediterranean. In fact, Italy as a whole becoming incredibly wealthy in connection with this revival in trade. Eventually, other parts of Europe are going to get involved as well. One very important region will be in the north, known as Flanders. It is a coastal area in northern Europe, roughly corresponding to modern-day Belgium. The most important cities there in this regard are going to be Ghent and Bruges. So they're not only active in trade, in this case Northern European trade, but also important centers for the production of woolen cloth. And by the 12th century, they're going to develop trade relations with Italy as well. And I think that's something very nicely illustrated by this map showing the major trade networks that are developing during the High Middle Ages. So in the north, marked in green, we have the Hanseatic routes, more or less corresponding to something called the Hanseatic League, which represents kind of developing economic and to some degree political ties between important trading cities in the north. In the Mediterranean, clearly we can see that the Venetians and eventually the Genoese have become dominant. Venetian routes represented in red, Genoese routes in yellow, and also how they're developing direct connections with the Hanseatic routes by going around the Iberian Peninsula, up the Atlantic coast. And very important in the sense that the benefits of this growing trade are eventually going to penetrate the interior. We see the development of overland connections marked here in blue. So if we're talking about growing trade in the interior, probably most important is going to be the emergence of trade fairs, right? So very often they are located along these overland connections. and kind of spaces designated for safe trading activity, highly supervised, probably somewhere near a fortified structure like a castle. And eventually settlements are going to develop around them and eventually become towns, and very wealthy towns at that. A really good example of this would be the town of Champagne in northern France. And yes, that is where the beverage champagne comes from. So eventually you're going to have 6 annually held fairs in Champagne. So this is really in high degree taking advantage of the trade running between Flanders and Italy. But it isn't only going to be Champagne, right? So you're going to really see a lot of, existing towns and cities taking advantage of this revival of trade, but also the founding of new cities and towns, especially in Northern Europe. So what very often happens is a settlement will emerge. Very often it might be in connection with trade, but it's probably also near a fortified stronghold, either a castle or maybe a highly developed monastery. And over time, its population grows, and eventually it becomes large enough that we can actually start thinking of it as a town. At that point, they probably build walls around it, which is one reason many of the names of these newly emerging towns have the term borough or burg in them. It basically means walled enclosure, right? So you might think of cities like Hamburg in the Germanic lands or Edinburgh in Scotland. And here we find an kind of artistic depiction of what a typical medieval merchant town might look like. And so kind of the main reason I'm showing you this is to kind of convey to you a sense of the hustle and bustle that would have been characteristic of such a community, just, kind of very active environment. What's really important in connection with the development of towns, we have the beginning of a new social group. We might probably the most basic term we might use for it is townspeople, mostly initially merchants and artisans. What's really key here is even though they are technically commoners and thus members of the third estate, they don't really conform to the structure of the three estates, right? As initially conceived, the third estate, made up primarily of peasants, had the chief function of providing the food and most basic necessities for the rest of society, for the other two estates, the clergy and the nobles, if you remember. Townspeople really don't fit into that structure very well. So first of all, they're not really beholden to the other two estates. They're becoming much more independent of them. Second of all, their activities are geared primarily not to serving the needs of the other two estates, but rather to the acquisition of wealth. In any event, at some point we refer to townspeople as either burghers or bourgeoisie. Some of you might be familiar with the term bourgeoisie because it eventually becomes a term utilized within Marxist theory. That is, of course, a bit down the road, but it does reflect the fact that this new group is becoming very wealthy, becoming increasingly influential, and is highly educated. And in those three regards, also distinguishing them from other commoners. Probably most important is at some point townspeople are governing themselves, right? Townspeople are eventually able to obtain charters of liberty. Sometimes they are able to compel a lord or a king to grant them this charter. In many cases, it is given them voluntarily. There's kind of a feeling that everyone benefits by, creating an environment wherein they're able to do what they do best, which is to make money. And that is often the argument, right? That they need certain freedoms and privileges in order to carry out business. And under the structure of the three estates, they really didn't have enough freedom to do this. So we're going to see the emergence of city governments, right, where cities and towns in many cases are effectively governing themselves. So this also kind of reflects a reconception of the relationship between government and those governed, right? So we have this concept emerging of citizenship, in this case reserved for males, obviously at that time, born in the city or residents of long standing, right? And related to this status of citizenship, of being a citizen, is that you have both certain rights but also certain obligations with respect to the city. both are evident in your connection to its government, right? So citizens not only serve on the city council but elect its members. City council, of course, is responsible for legislation within the city. Citizens also serve as judges and administrative officials. Now, we should be careful. At some point, it becomes pretty clear that not all citizens are created equal. Government very quickly becoming dominated by a limited number of wealthy families, often referred to as patricians, as kind of an old Roman term designating elite members of society. And by the way, this is another term relevant here is that of oligarchy. Oligarchy, when you have government that is basically dominated by and run on behalf of the interests of a limited number of important families. So that becomes a very common feature of particularly larger cities that are beginning to emerge during the high Middle Ages. One last thing we should note that in many cases, eventually they create a new position, a sole executive leader that is often referred to as a mayor. So, kind of illustrative of some aspects of city government that we've been discussing, that existed during the High Middle Ages. On the one hand, this idea that a limited number of wealthy families end up dominating government. Sometimes it might even be like one family in particular. A really good example of that would be the Medici family in Florence. Here we see one of the more important members of that family, Lorenzo de' Medici. Incredibly wealthy family, in many ways connected with banking, but also becoming very dominant in the governance of Florence. And later important patrons, we're going to meet them again when we look at Renaissance art. They become important patrons of such artists as Michelangelo. On the right, we see the Doge Palace, which is where the city council in Venice would have held session. And not just this structure. I mean, if you visit Venice, one thing that impresses you right away is the tremendous wealth of the city, evident in its architecture, much of which was, beginning to be built during this period. So that wealth obviously tied primarily to trade. At this point, I want to consider one last very important institution from the time of the High Middle Ages. It's relevant, especially economically, but it also has a very kind of important role in terms of the social structure of towns and cities, and that would be the guild. So from the 12th century on, merchants and artisans would be organized into guilds based around whatever particular craft or activity they were engaged in, right? So there could be a guild, for instance, for shoemakers, a guild for, individuals responsible for cloth production and so forth, right? So the guilds, sometimes when we talk about the guild in the class, some students say, oh, it's like a union. And certainly the guild would concern itself with protecting its members, but it also regulated its members, right? So really directed, and we're talking about in fine detail every aspect of production. It would set standards in terms of the quality of whatever was being produced, standards regarding the methods of production, and even setting the price, right? So in this regard, kind of very, very different than what you find in a kind of more capitalistic system, where, for instance, different shoemakers might be competing with one another by either trying to produce a better shoe or a cheaper shoe. That is impossible. That is not possible within the guild structure, right? In terms of its social impact, it defined in a very, very precise way how one entered a trade, the various steps you had to go through. So kind of also defining your social position within the town community. So if you wanted to enter a trade, right, you didn't just set up shop, right? You had to become an apprentice to a master craftsman, right? So, I mean, if you're like, oh gosh, I really want to make shoes, first of all, you probably should decide this. It might be your parent who decided this early on. This would begin around the age of 10. And in many ways, that master craftsman would become almost like your parent, and you would work for him for 5 to 7 years without pay, right? The idea that you're kind of still learning the trade, developing your skills and so forth. At some point, you would become a journeyman, right? That you had mastered the trade or craft sufficiently that you should now be paid for your work, right? So you're now working for wages. But you're not yet a master, right? To become a master, the journeyman has to produce what's known as a masterpiece, a finished piece which would be judged to see whether you were qualified to be given the rank of master. And some of you are probably familiar with the term masterpiece in connection with art. That's because back at this time, if you were a painter, it was perceived more as a craft than as a kind of artistic endeavor. The way we think of art is kind of much more individual pursuit today. So back then, you would have to go through the same steps. There would be a guild for painters or people engaged in artistic activities. And eventually you'd have to produce a masterpiece, which would be judged to see whether you were qualified to be made a master. And by the way, it wasn't only in the field of art that you had, kind of this kind of guild structure operating. This also, in many ways, is how the university came about. In fact, the word universitas, which is Latin, essentially means a guild of teachers or students. And so the modern university, as we conceive of it today, in many ways taking its basic form during the High Middle Ages. Many aspects of the university, the idea that you have a faculty of instructors, what it means to be a student, the idea that you receive instruction from the faculty, that you eventually are awarded a degree indicating that you've kind of mastered your subject and so forth. All of this developing during the High Middle Ages. So the universities didn't just come out of nowhere. Before them, you had what are known as cathedral schools that were organized around cathedrals by the more secular members of the clergy, such that by around 1100, the heart of the High Middle Ages, they were quite common. And initially, the main purpose was to educate priests, but increasingly they began to attract other individuals who were seeking an education. So we might consider here the fact that you have this emerging bourgeois social group, right? These are, commoners who are highly educated and very often are going to want to have their children receive an education as well. And so these are the kind of individuals that are going to be drawn to a fair extent. Also children of nobles and so forth, right? These are the kind of individuals that are going to be drawn to the cathedral schools, which means also you're going to start to see kind of a shift away from a more religious education to a more secular one. One last thing, it's kind of interesting to consider that many of the titles associated with university officials actually started out as cathedral chapter officials, like chancellor, provost, dean, and so forth. So some historians would argue that the first proper university to emerge during this period was the University of Bologna. Bologna is a city in Italy. And so it kind of started out exactly as a guild or università that was granted to students in a charter issued by the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in 1158, right? So for their protection. But right there you can kind of see its separation from the cathedral school system. And related to that, the subject matter is definitely going to become much more secular. For instance, the University of Bologna became very famous for the study of Roman law. And before too long, universities like the one in Bologna are going to start popping up across Europe, not just in the Mediterranean world. And so just to give an example, and because I couldn't resist putting my alma mater here, one good example in Northern Europe would be the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, which isn't quite as old as the University of Bologna, but definitely goes back a long way. So I'd like to conclude the first half of our lecture corresponding to Chapter 15 by looking at broader developments related to the growing authority of kings. We might say it's kind of the development or growth of national monarchies, in some ways politically characterizing the High Middle Ages. So, this is, if you were taking History 115, one thing we would have talked about in connection with feudalism is how, in actual reality, even though in theory kings had tremendous authority, in actual reality they often had very little real power, right? So in theory, kings, were to be obeyed by their vassals. Vassals referring to the various lords underneath their authority of different ranking, but particularly those at the top, kind of high lords, very often within their own respective regions would have exercised a great deal more authority than the king in actual practice, right? So, first of all, even in theory, the king had to honor certain rights and privileges that belonged to the nobles, right? That he was unable to impose upon them. But even where the king, in theory, had the right to impose upon the lords, very often he found it difficult to do so. So we didn't really, talk about this in our lecture until now. This would have been a part of History 115. But the king does not have a standing army. His army is dependent on the lords, right? The lords round up, lesser lords who round up knights and so forth when the king calls upon them for service. But that means, you can't really use the army against the lords since it's made up of the lords. And if a lord feels it's in his interest not to comply with the will of the king, particularly if it's a weak king, right? Someone's not particularly charismatic and so forth, not particularly capable as a ruler, he just might not go along with what the king wants. In fact, in some cases, weak kings end up being overthrown, right? So, yes, in theory, kings had absolute authority, but in actual practice, wasn't often the case. But that is going to begin changing now, right? Part of this reflects the fact that kings do have certain advantages, and they're going to start taking advantage of those prerogatives that they do have in order to consolidate authority within their hands. So first of all, they are religiously sanctioned, right? The idea that kings rule by divine right, and if a king is savvy enough, he might be able to take advantage of this. If you're a lord, you're a bit reluctant maybe to go against the king. It's not going to reflect well on the king, as far as how the king's subjects within your region view you. So, a savvy king might be able to utilize that to his advantage. Kings can increase their power through war and marriage, right? So if the kingdom does go to war and territory is conquered, it does belong to the king, right? Territory might also be acquired through royal marriage, right? If you're, kind of arranging a marriage with a princess from another important family. The king might then use this territory to reward his loyal followers, right, with grants of land, for instance, following a conquest or acquired through marriage, right? So again, if the king is clever, if he's a capable ruler, very charismatic and so forth, might be able to use, these advantages in order to consolidate authority within his hands more. So, we're going to also look at specific historical events that correspond to, kind of the strengthening and growth of these national monarchies, starting with England. And probably a good place to start is with the Battle of Hastings, which takes place in 1066. I will expect you to remember that. It's just one of those major battles, in this case in the kind of broader history of England, where a fellow named William of Normandy basically is going to seize power after laying claim to the throne. William of Normandy, he belonged to a people known as the Normans, right? So they were essentially a Viking people, but through, kind of the nature of his relationship to, various other royal figures in Europe, he had a claim to the English throne, and this became the basis of why he launched an attack. The Battle of Hastings will take place on October 14th, 1066. He will be victorious, and then eventually will be crowned King of England on Christmas Day of that year. So the Battle of Hastings, again, seen as kind of a seminal event in the history of England, is depicted, in various ways artistically. Probably the most famous would be the Bayeux Tapestry. It's like, tapestry is like a rug that hangs on the wall, and this is like, really of massive size, with a lot of fine detail depicting the Battle of Hastings. Well, sometimes when you have a, kind of new ruling dynasty establishing itself, it presents the opportunity for, kind of making changes in the manner of government, in this case in a way that's going to strengthen the hand of the king. One important development under William is going to be the creation of a permanent royal treasury known as the Exchequer, meaning greater revenue for the king. And, in some ways, that is at the foundation of any attempt by a king to strengthen his authority over his kingdom. Revenue means, you have the option of creating a professional army of paid soldiers who answer directly to you. Revenue means creating a bureaucracy whereby you might govern directly through government officials instead of having to work through nobles in each individual region. The jurisdiction of royal courts is going to be expanded with respect to the number and types of criminal cases tried in them. That means that the king is going to play a much bigger role with respect to justice. And on that note, we should also note the development of a body of common law to replace local law codes. And in fact, we still have common law in England today. Common in the sense that, a body of law that is common to the whole kingdom instead of having, various laws that very often conflicted with one another as you move from one region to another. Now, one indication that kings are becoming more powerful in England is going to be when nobles push back. They become very resentful of the growing power of the king and eventually rebel. This is going to happen under King John in 1215, who is able to avoid an actual battle when at Runnymede, which is probably where the battle would have taken place. Otherwise, we'd be talking about the Battle of Runnymede. He agrees to something called the Magna Carta to sign off on this document. It literally just means Great Charter, and you've actually had a number of Magna Cartas throughout the history of England. But this is the Magna Carta of 1215, right? The definitive one. And it basically sets limits on government practices. Right. So, in one sense, kind of reflecting, kind of a step backwards in terms of kings consolidating their authority. But in terms of how things develop after that, while the actual role of the king within the larger governmental structure might be diminished somewhat, it will be part of the story of kind of the growing power of the central government. It's just that government is going to be represented by a kind of partnership. We'll get to that in a second, but one last thing to note with the Magna Carta. At the time, really intended as, kind of a basis for preserving the rights and privileges of nobles, but eventually perceived as defining an important principle of government, that a king's authority should be limited rather than absolute. Right? And that will become very important in connection with other ideas that will develop down the road about, how government should be on behalf of the people, not something imposed on the people and so forth. Regarding what I refer to as kind of a partnership, what we see taking place alongside these other developments is the emergence of Parliament, which had started out as an informal council of advisors to the king, but eventually begins to play a much more defined role with respect to government, particularly taxation. So eventually the idea is going to develop, and I should know, for a long time it's going to be, kind of more a, shall we say, gentleman's agreement than something kind of formally sanctioned, for instance, in a document. That in order for the king to issue new taxes, it must be approved by the Parliament, right? And this actually starts when, in 1295, Edward I invites a number of individuals representative of his subjects to participate in the first proper Parliament in order to consent to new taxes, right? It's just kind of the feeling that, taxing the people is more legitimate if it has the seal of approval of some kind of representative body. In this case, consisting of 2 knights from each county and 2 residents from each town. And this will end up becoming kind of the foundation of 2 different bodies that make up the Parliament. On the one hand, the House of Lords, made up of barons and church lords. On the other, the House of Commons, made up of knights and burgesses, or bourgeois individuals coming from the towns, and that will be the House of Commons, right? And of course, even today, if we talk about the British Parliament, you still have a House of Lords and a House of Commons, and the House of Commons eventually becoming the more important body, particularly with respect to legislation. In France, things are going to develop a bit differently. There, the authority of the king will just continue to grow and grow until we have something that we call absolute monarchy, right? The kind of idea and to some extent the reality of a king having absolute authority. We might start our story in France with the Capetian dynasty, which in the 10th century was the ruling dynasty in France. At that point, very little real power beyond Paris and the immediate surrounding area, what was known as the Ile-de-France, or the island of France. But then, through war with England, the royal family was able to gain control of Normandy, which was a kind of large amount of territory, and then even other territories. And as we already discussed, that became a basis for the king acquiring more power, right? Rewarding those who were most loyal, kind of assuring that they were loyal to him, but also eventually is going to be a source of greater revenue, basically quadrupling the French monarchy's income and thus enhancing its power. Probably the most important figure, individual with respect to these developments, would be Philip IV, who at some point found himself in potential conflict with the Pope. And related to this, in 1302, he summoned a meeting of representatives of the church, nobility, and towns. Again, it was kind of revolving around the possibility of issuing new taxes and wanting to make it legitimate. And this will become, something of a parliamentary body, something a little bit similar to what we saw developing in England. In this case, known as the Estates General, because in theory it consists of three bodies representing the three estates, i.e., the clergy, nobility, and commoners, represented here by the towns. The thing is, you never had something equivalent to a Magna Carta up until this point. And so, while there's this kind of potential for a developing partnership between the king and some kind of representative body, over time, the authority of the king will just continue to grow, and that of the Estates General will diminish to the point where, in fact, even though it still exists on paper, it's never actually called into session anymore. So it never really becomes as powerful as the Parliament in England. And we should look at what one might call a failed attempt at consolidating authority within the hands of a single individual, and that really corresponds to the Holy Roman Empire. What we see on the map here from around roughly 1100, you'll note it corresponds roughly to the central and northern parts of Italy, most of what today is Germany and some parts of modern-day France. So we talked a bit about this. You have a figure known as the Holy Roman Emperor. So in theory, the various rulers of all the kingdoms that make up the Holy Roman Empire owe him their allegiance, but in fact, they're pretty much independent. Though, as of 1100, it isn't entirely clear, whether, as is happening in the kingdoms of France and England, maybe there is a possibility that the Holy Roman Emperor would be able to consolidate his authority over them. The first real attempt at this is going to be under Frederick I Barbarossa. Barbarossa means red beard, by the way, and he had a red beard. He is the Holy Roman Emperor during the latter part of the 12th century from the House of Hohenstaufen. And so he comes up with kind of an interesting strategy about how to consolidate his authority. He's going to focus first on Italy, right? And the idea is if he can, and remember, this is a period when trade is reviving, northern Italy becoming very wealthy. So his plan is basically if he can kind of bring them to heel, they would become a source of, real boost in revenue for his court, and then that would provide a basis for basically imposing his control over the German part of his kingdom. Pretty sound plan on paper, but unfortunately this brings him ultimately into conflict with the Pope and the northern Italian cities. Initially, this doesn't seem sufficient to undermine the broader strategy, Frederick arrives at a settlement with the northern Italian cities, basically giving them a fair degree of autonomy in exchange for annual payments to him. This would give him the revenue he needs to bring the Germanic states under his authority. Problem might be that perhaps he became a bit too greedy. He then goes after southern Italy, which he's hoping to bring under his control by marrying his son Henry IV to the heiress to the throne there. But this kind of falls through when Henry dies prematurely. In the meantime, the northern Italian city-states are becoming concerned about the role he's playing in Italy, and they start to kind of back off on the deal. And so he's never really able to execute part B of his plan to bring the Germanic states under his authority directly. His son Frederick II will kind of make a second attempt, focusing on bringing the Italian states under his direct authority. But to make the long story short, he's going to prove unsuccessful as well. So the Holy Roman Empire is going to carry on for a while. There will be a few more attempts at making it kind of a more meaningful political entity in the sense of the emperor having real authority over the various states that make it up. But it's never really going to happen. So both Germany and Italy will essentially remain loose confederations of independent states. It won't be until the 19th century that we see the unification of both Germany and Italy. That's a story for much further down the road. In the meantime, the title of Holy Roman Emperor increasingly becoming mostly symbolic to the point of being meaningless until finally the entire institution is abolished by Napoleon at the beginning of the 19th century. So this is a good place to stop. We've pretty much laid the foundation for what ultimately I think is the real focus of this chapter, Renaissance art, and that's what we're going to be talking about in part 2. So I'll see you there.